Karoline Leavitt had made waves as a conservative figure, and she was gaining attention quickly. The host had criticized conservatives before, but this time it felt different. There was a strange edge to his words, something that felt a little too personal. Viewers could sense the tension building. What was he going to say next? The audience leaned in closer, waiting for his next words, unsure of what to expect. Then, out of nowhere, he made a comment that shocked everyone. It wasn't just harsh or critical. It was something that crossed a line. The viewers couldn't believe what they were hearing. The studio fell silent for a few seconds as the host continued, seemingly unaware of the gravity of his words. The shock wasn't just felt by the viewers. Even the crew behind the cameras was frozen in disbelief. What had the host just said? Was this real? Surely, this would have consequences, right? The audience didn't know it at the time, but that one comment was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything for him. People started sharing the clip online, and soon, social media was flooded with reactions. But as the clip spread, so did the outrage. Within hours, the internet was ablaze. The host's comment about Karoline Leavitt had gone viral, and people from all sides were weighing in. Some defended the host, saying he had a right to free speech. Others were furious, demanding that he be held accountable for his words. It wasn't long before the backlash reached the network's executives. The network, known for its liberal leanings, found itself in an awkward position. They had supported the host for years, backing him through controversies before. But this time, it was different. The comments about Leavitt weren't just controversial. They were offensive. People began calling for the host to be fired, and advertisers were starting to pull their support from the show. The network couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. As the backlash continued to grow, the host remained silent. His usual presence on social media was strangely absent. Some wondered if he was in damage control mode, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Others speculated that he was in shock, unable to believe that his words had caused such an uproar. Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. His career was in serious jeopardy. The network executives held emergency meetings, trying to figure out what to do next. Should they stand by their host, or should they cut ties with him to protect their reputation? The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the network's decision, but the longer they waited, the worse the situation became. Behind the scenes, the host was facing the reality of the situation. He had received calls from his agent, the network, and even friends warning him about the backlash. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was coming. The network had given him an ultimatum: apologize or face the consequences. The host struggled with what to do next. On one hand, he could issue a public apology, hoping to calm the situation and save his career. On the other hand, he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he had simply expressed an opinion, just like he had done countless times before. But this time, the stakes were much higher. As the pressure mounted, the host realized that his decision could determine the course of his career. If he apologized, would it be enough to satisfy the outraged viewers and advertisers? Or would it be seen as a sign of weakness, alienating his core audience who appreciated his boldness? The decision weighed heavily on him, and time was running out. Meanwhile, the network was growing increasingly nervous. The longer the controversy dragged on, the more they risked losing. Advertisers were pulling out left and right, and the show's ratings were starting to drop. Something had to be done, and fast. After days of silence, the host finally addressed the controversy. He released a carefully crafted statement, but it wasn't exactly the apology people were hoping for. Instead of expressing regret, he doubled down on his comments about Karoline Leavitt. He claimed that his words had been taken out of context and that he had simply been speaking the truth. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. People were more outraged than ever, and the network was left scrambling to contain the damage. Behind closed doors, executives were furious. They had hoped that the host would issue a sincere apology, but instead, he had made things worse. The network's leadership held another emergency meeting. This time, the decision was clear. They couldn't afford to keep the host on the air any longer. He had become too much of a liability. In a unanimous decision, the executives decided to fire him. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the media world. The host, who had been a fixture on the network for years, was suddenly out of a job. His career, which had once seemed unstoppable, had come crashing down in a matter of days. But the fallout didn't end there. In the weeks following the host's firing, the story continued to dominate the headlines. Some people celebrated the network's decision, calling it a victory for accountability. Others were outraged, accusing the network of censorship. The debate raged on, but one thing was certain: the host's career would never be the same. As for the host himself, he retreated from the public eye. He issued a brief statement thanking his fans for their support, but he offered no further comment on the controversy. Some wondered if he would ever make a comeback, while others believed that his time in the spotlight was over for good. Karoline Leavitt, the subject of the host's shocking comments, remained relatively quiet throughout the ordeal. She acknowledged the controversy in a brief interview, but she chose not to engage in a public feud. Instead, she continued to focus on her political career, using the attention to further solidify her position as a rising star in the conservative movement. The host's life took a sharp turn after his firing. Jobs offers that once flooded and were now non-existent. He was left questioning everything: his career, his values, and the decisions that had led to his downfall. Friends in the industry distanced themselves, fearful of being associated with the controversy. The once celebrated TV host, now without a platform, found himself isolated in a world that had quickly moved on. His name, which had once been a symbol of boldness and liberal ideals, was now associated with scandal. Despite his strong stance during the controversy, the host began to question whether it had all been worth it. He had been so confident in his opinions, so sure that his words would resonate with his audience. But the fallout was more devastating than he had ever anticipated. As he scrolled through the countless articles, social media posts, and opinion pieces that dissected his downfall, a sense of bitterness crept in. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? He had been in the industry long enough to survive scandals before, but this time felt different. His comment about Karoline Leavitt had touched a nerve that he hadn't anticipated. The pressure mounted as days turned into weeks. Financially, the impact was starting to become clear. His income had come to a grinding halt, and without the lucrative contracts and sponsorships he had grown accustomed to, maintaining his lifestyle became increasingly difficult. Bills piled up, and he began to feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. His friends, once eager to support him, were nowhere to be found. He reached out to some, but the conversations were brief and awkward. Many of them didn't want to be associated with his name, fearing the negative press that came with being connected to the scandal. The host's circle grew smaller and smaller, leaving him alone to deal with the aftermath of his choices. As the weeks went on, he began to reflect on what had led him to this point. Could he have handled the situation differently? Should he have apologized, even if he didn't fully believe he was in the wrong? The questions haunted him, keeping him up at night as he replayed the events over and over in his mind. In the midst of his internal struggle, the host received an offer, an interview with a major news outlet, eager to get his side of the story. It was a chance to explain himself, to set the record straight, but it was also a risk. Would speaking out again make things worse? Or could it be his opportunity for redemption? After much consideration, the host decided to accept the interview. It was a risky move, but he knew that remaining silent would only make him fade further into obscurity. If he had any chance of rebuilding his career, he had to take control of the narrative. The day of the interview arrived, and the host felt a mixture of nerves and determination. This was his chance to make things right, or at least try. The interview started with the usual pleasantries, but it wasn't long before the host was asked about the comment that had cost him his career. He took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes could determine the course of his future. For the first time, he acknowledged that his words had been hurtful. He admitted that, in hindsight, he had crossed a line. But as the interview continued, the host didn't back down from his core beliefs. He explained that while he regretted how his words had been interpreted, he still stood by the importance of free speech and the need to challenge political figures, regardless of their affiliations. His tone was measured, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control over the situation. The reaction to the interview was mixed. Some viewers appreciated his honesty and willingness to admit his mistakes, while others felt that his apology wasn't enough. But regardless of the public's reaction, the host felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He had finally had the chance to speak his truth, and that was something no one could take away from him. In the months that followed, the host slowly began to rebuild his life. He started a podcast where he could speak his mind without the constraints of network executives or advertisers. It wasn't the same as being on TV, but it was a platform where he could be unapologetically himself. And though his audience was smaller, it was fiercely loyal. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, continued her rise in politics, using the controversy to her advantage. She had come out of the ordeal unscathed, while the host had been left to pick up the pieces of his career. But in the end, both of their lives had been forever changed by the incident. As for the host, he had learned a hard lesson about the power of words and the consequences that come with them. His journey wasn't over, and while the road ahead was uncertain, he was determined to keep moving forward one step at a time. Months had passed since the TV host's fall from grace, but the shockwaves of the incident still lingered. The media had largely moved on, focusing on new controversies and scandals, but for the host, the impact was everlasting. He had lost his position, his status, and much of his reputation, but in the quiet aftermath, he discovered something unexpected: clarity. The podcast he started after his firing had grown slowly but steadily. It wasn't anywhere near the massive audience he used to command, but it was different. The people who tuned in weren't just casual viewers. They were engaged listeners, people who wanted to hear him speak unfiltered. His podcast became a platform where he could dive deeper into issues without worrying about network oversight or offending advertisers. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. This wasn't about fame anymore. It was about being authentic, speaking from the heart. As the podcast gained traction, he started to rebuild his personal life as well. Friends who had distanced themselves during the controversy began to reconnect, slowly testing the waters to see if they could resume their relationships without the fear of public scrutiny. Some friendships remained fractured beyond repair, but new connections formed, ones that were built on shared values rather than just professional convenience. Financially, things were tougher than before. Without the big TV contracts and sponsorship deals, the host had to adjust to a more modest lifestyle. Gone were the lavish dinners, the high-end cars, and the extravagant vacations. But in this simplification of his life, he found peace. He realized how much of his previous life had been driven by the need to maintain appearances. Now, stripped of that pressure, he focused on what really mattered: his voice and his message. Karoline Leavitt's rise in politics continued, though her name was forever tied to the controversy. She had used the incident to solidify her base, framing herself as a victim of liberal media bias. Her speeches often referenced the attack on her character, and it resonated with her supporters. They saw her as someone who had weathered the storm and come out stronger. The host couldn't help but feel a pang of regret whenever he saw her on TV or read about her in the news. His careless words had given her a platform to elevate herself further, something he hadn't anticipated. But in time, the host made peace with it. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. He focused on making his podcast better, discussing topics that mattered to him and to his audience. The conversations were deeper, more meaningful, and less about sensationalism. And though he wasn't on the front lines of the media world anymore, he was okay with that. He had found his place, and it was enough. As for the industry that had cast him aside, it marched forward without him, as it always does. New hosts filled his old spot, and new controversies replaced his. The TV world is ever evolving, with a constant need for fresh faces and new dramas. The host knew that, even in the darkest moments of his fall, the machine would go on with or without him. But for him, life wasn't about chasing the spotlight anymore. It was about staying true to himself, about using his voice for something real, something that mattered. He had lost so much, but in the process, he had gained a sense of clarity that he had never had before. He wasn't the man he had been before the scandal, and he was grateful for that. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. And in the quiet moments, as he sat at his microphone preparing for his next episode, he realized that this new chapter of his life was just beginning. The podcast episodes that followed featured honest conversations about freedom of speech, accountability, and the fine line between criticism and insult. He invited guests from across the political spectrum, fostering dialogue rather than division. Slowly, his platform became known for its thoughtfulness. And though the path was hard-fought, he felt a sense of pride in where he had ended up. Karoline Leavitt remained in the political spotlight, a key figure on the national stage. But the host no longer viewed her as an enemy. She was part of his story, just as he was part of hers. They were connected through that brief, explosive moment, but they had both moved on to their own destinies. In the end, the host found peace not in reclaiming his former glory, but in building something new. His story wasn't about triumph over others. It was about finding redemption in himself. And as he prepared to record the next episode of his podcast, he smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over.